on the line, and the international community continue to inspire us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Please sit. So good evening, everyone, and it's a privilege and pleasure to be here this evening. And I got to say that this whole ceremony is redolent of Alma Adams. When I walked into the room, I was sure she was the one who decorated it, chose the colors, and made sure you were all dressed up in suits. So it's a good thing I didn't wear Guayabera tonight, because I'd have been ashamed. But I'm grateful for the service which she gave in organizing this institute and the dedication that she gave to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to our country, having served both as a public official and as a public servant. And on a personal level, she and I were both members of St. Agnes Church, so we both loved evensong, which is the Anglican service at nighttime on Sundays. So more often than not, I would see her in what we call in St. Agnes the guardhouse, which is the area at the back below where the organ is, the organ loft is. And so I miss her in all kinds of ways. And I really want to thank her family again for her life of service. And I'm happy that you're able to be here this evening, because this is really the house that Alma built. So thank you, Alma. And then I wanted to say a word about Alrae Ramsey, because Alrae was a young Foreign Service officer. He was barely, maybe within 10 years of service in the ministry. And there was a bit of controversy about naming this institute after him, because he's a very young man, and usually you don't get things named after you until you're dead and gone, and quite advanced in age. Unfortunately, he passed away, or we died, in circumstances which we still don't quite accept or understand. But he was, in my view, emblematic of your generation. Well-educated, ambitious, and was obviously going places. And his life was cut short too soon. There's a lesson behind it in this, and I was explaining to him just before he left to go to the Diplomatic Institute in Vienna, that after we lost office in 2017, I told him that, and this is a lesson for all of you, when there's a regime change, there's an immediate impact within the agency that you work for. And as soon as the new minister comes in, someone will go to him and say, this one is PLP, this one is F&M. And immediately the minister will act to isolate those who are perceived to be not part of his party. And nothing happens for you after that. And he was the object of that, because it was perceived that he had an alliance with me. So as soon as the new minister came in, he was in Iceland. And I was speaking to him on the phone, and I was saying to him, you have two choices during a period like this. One is, you know that things are not going to remain the same, so all you have to do is sit and wait, stay in your corner, and there'll be regime change again, and when your man comes in or woman comes in, you'll be back in the saddle. Or you could choose another career opportunity. And if you choose the first alternative, which is to wait, just go back to school. And he chose to go to school, and go to school at one of the more distinguished institutions in the world for training of diplomats in Vienna. And of course, that decision ultimately led to his passing because he joined a friend of his who was doing a presentation as part of his PhD training in Turin, Italy. And while he was in Italy, they died, both men, and we don't understand why. But I thought to myself that naming this institute after him should be an example to all of you as younger Foreign Service officers about what you should be aspiring for and accomplishing. And I hope that naming the institute after him inspires you to have a lifelong interest and occupation in foreign diplomacy, foreign service, and that years from now, that you'll be Directors General, Permanent Secretary if you want to go the administrative track, ambassadors. And I constructed this is my third time in this job, and I don't believe lightning is going to strike 4 times. So I'm trying to make sure that this time we set in place a framework which will actually provide the fillip for the country in the next 50 years of its development. And to construct a foreign service that's not academic in nature, although academic training has to be part of it, but to construct a foreign service that draws from every tier of the Bahamian society. And the Institute would therefore fill in the training for those who did not get the background in foreign service training. But what you would bring to the foreign service, because it's essentially a service where you serve overseas, is that you will carry the cultural memory that the Director General talked about with you wherever you go. So, example, I was just saying to someone just sent me a message about what one of our friends are doing, trying to claim other people's territory. And they just listed a whole lot of things that they're going to do. And I said to them, in the words of the people in the playground, they're ma. And that's, part of our cultural lexicon. I don't suggest you say that in public, though. I want to recognize the Parliamentary Secretary, Jamal Strawn, who's a Member of Parliament for Nassau Village, and he is a former Foreign Service officer. So you see the track that you are entered on. You could one day do that as well. And the Director General, Jerusha Ali, who is the daughter of my English teacher and my former headmaster at St. Augustine's College. So it's very interesting how life works in a circle. And it's good that she's setting the pace forward for the ministry. And part of the reason, too, the Institute came about was I was in Governor's Harbor, Lutheran. And I took, what I try to do as minister is to make sure that every trip that I go on, a Foreign Service officer goes with me, because again, my philosophy is that you ought to know the country that you live in. So you don't end up being like the public servant who was fussing out the man doing the logistics for the Bahamas Games because he was arranging a charter from Black Point to Nassau and a charter from Georgetown to Nassau. And his superior called him in and said, "Why are you wasting the public's money? Why couldn't you just put the people in Black Point on a bus, take them to Georgetown, and fly them all to Nassau?" Of course, that's impossible because they're on 2 different islands. So you gotta know the country you're in. And we were sitting at dinner in Governor's Harbor at the restaurant 1648, named after the first year of settlement in the Bahamas by the Brits. And one of the young people sitting at the table said to the Foreign Service officer, "So what does a Foreign Service officer do?" And I was shocked the Foreign Service officer couldn't answer the question. So I said, well, we got to rectify this, because at least you ought to know what your job is and be able to explain that to the public. Because remember that we are in an age of public diplomacy. When Luther Smith, Ambassador Wright, both joined the Foreign Service, they didn't have to worry about public diplomacy. They didn't worry about that, about what the public thought about what you're doing. But these days, everything is in the public limelight. And so you've got to be able to defend what you do. And the Institute is designed to give you that defense. And so you have Ambassador Gilbert Morris, who was just talking in the piece about your ability to interact with the international community and explain why the Bahamas is what it is and does what it does. And there's an exercise of something that Joe Nye of Harvard University calls soft power, which means the ability to use moral suasion to bring about a result in favor of the Bahamas. And right now, the Prime Minister says that climate change is the #1 foreign policy issue for the Bahamas, and it is existential. Said before, there's a map of the island of New Providence, and it shows that in 2070, if things don't go in the other direction, that 30% of New Providence will be underwater. And by 2100, 70% of New Providence will be underwater. And this doesn't happen like an avalanche. It's happening now. People complain, for example, about the state of the roads. One of the reasons the state of the roads is because the water table is getting higher and higher and higher, so the roads are unstable. And every 2 years or 3 years, instead of every 10 years, we have to fix the roads, all of the roads again. That's called loss and damage. That's called adaptation and mitigation of damage. And we don't have the money. I was just remarking that we're now listed as having GDP per capita of 41,000 US a year. Now, that makes us like the third or something country in the hemisphere in terms of GDP per capita. And as long as they use that measure to allocate monies in public finance, international finance, we've got a problem. Because if a hurricane hits, we have to go to the markets to pay. No one's going to give us concessionary money. So what the Prime Minister is doing is trying to lead the charge overseas to use our voice to shift public opinion on this matter. And notwithstanding what you hear in the public domain, so many of the treasuries of these developed countries do not believe what we're saying. They haven't been convinced that that's the right thing to do. As a matter of fact, the Prime Minister in his address in Dubai was saying that they seem more concerned about quieting the public noise as opposed to dealing with the problem. So, we go to these fora and we give our speeches and they hear us making noise. So they say, okay, take this 100 million and see what you can do with that. But that doesn't ultimately solve the problem. So your job as Foreign Service officers will be, of course, prosecuting that issue. And so there's going to be, I hope, a recruitment in the coming year of additional Foreign Service officers so that we avoid the problem which now obtains in the Foreign Service, where for a long period of time, almost 10 years, I would say, we adopted the false gospel that a way of solving our deficit problems was not to hire people in the public service and in the Foreign Service. So about 10 years, there was no recruitment. And the result is you have, up at the top, well-trained people who are experienced. Down at the bottom, you have new people who are just learning the skills, and in the middle, no one. So middle management is sort of empty, and we're struggling with that issue. So we're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future. And I took this from a man named Grafton Eiffel, who used to be Assistant Commissioner of Police, used to run the police force up in Grand Bahama. And he said that, he told me in a discussion once, he said that every year the police force has to recruit from, this word, the cohort for that year. So every class that comes out of school, the police has to make sure that they get some from that class. And he said, it's as simple as this. Each class knows the crooks in their class. So you got to get them, so they match them. So that's the same thing in the Foreign Service. I mean, you're not looking for crooks, but you know where your cohort is, the people in your generation, what they think, what their ideas are, and you bring those to the table when you join the Foreign Service. And what you also do is that you have a number of roles which you play, because we do not have a Foreign Service which we can have an embassy in every country. So there's two things. We have started a whole series of what we call thematic ambassadors. So you have an ambassador for human rights, ambassador at large. You also have non-resident ambassadors. But you have to look at a non-resident ambassador as having an embassy. His or her embassy is actually in Nassau. And each non-resident ambassador or thematic ambassador should have a Foreign Service officer who is in effect their DCM. And that officer is responsible for making sure that the work of that ambassador gets done. So if you're a non-resident ambassador, for example, for New Zealand, you're supposed to make sure that policy as regards the Bahamas and New Zealand is driven, and the ambassador or high commissioner, as they're called, is supported in what they do. So, and that is likely to continue because we have a mandate now to do a couple of things going forward. One is to negotiate visa abolition agreements with countries, and the other is to conclude diplomatic relations with countries. And there are 192 countries at the UN, so we've got some way to go in all of these issues. The Prime Minister is likely to be traveling to the non-aligned movement in Kampala at the end of January. And one of the reasons he's doing that is because we have a campaign coming up for, is it 31, 32?
2032, 33.
32, 33 for the Security Council of the United Nations. And that's going to be an amazing campaign. We just did a great job getting into the IMO again. So I want to thank all of the officers for their work with that. And we've now, we were elected to the Human Rights Council. We're the first CARICOM country to do that. But the big one is the Security Council, to get on that as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. So that's going to take a great deal of lobbying, and so non-aligned movement is where all the countries will be gathering in Kampala, and we're trying to make sure the Prime Minister goes there. And to conclude articles of diplomatic relations with many of those countries and these visa abolition agreements. And so we'll be present, sometimes not physically present. Our multilateral diplomacy is what we use as the most efficient way for a small country to conduct its affairs. So there's a heads of government meeting which will be taking place in November of next year. 53 countries that we would not normally get together and see, we'll be able to interact with them at that time. The meeting is going to be in Samoa, which is going to be in the Pacific, and of course they are a small island developing state like us, and so there is the issue of climate change as it affects them. They've already gone to the extent of negotiating with Australia as a place to go when their country disappears into the sea. And the question is that something we have to be thinking about with regard to our neighbor, to the United States? If the country's actually sinking into the sea, is the U.S. the place we have to negotiate to go? That's where things are at the moment. So I would also say this in terms of how policy is decided, and this probably is something that you already know, but it bears repeating. Remember that everything, the Constitution of the Bahamas says that the executive authority of the country is vested in the cabinet. So the cabinet is responsible for running the country on a day-to-day basis. So everything that you execute comes from what is known as a cabinet conclusion. And the financial officers take this to the extreme. But nothing happens unless you have those paragraphs which says you have permission to do so. And in the Foreign Service, this comes most often when it has to do with agreements with other countries, whether memoranda of understanding or formal treaties which take place between countries. You can't fly overseas and someone pushes a piece of paper in your face and say, here, sign this, and then you sign it, unless you have the authority to sign it. And you've got to go back always and check. When I was minister a couple times before, one of my colleagues went down to Latin America and just signed off on some deal and came back and said, fellas, I got a good deal. Of course, didn't have permission to do so. So I was sent at another meeting subsequent to that to try and patch up our retreat from this agreement that had been signed. Now, the only reason I tell that story is because the meeting took place in Jamaica, in Montego Bay, and two fascinating international characters were at that meeting, so I was grateful to be able to tell this story for you. One was Fidel Castro, and the other was Hugo Chavez. Chavez was the chairman of the meeting, and Castro was a guest in Jamaica. P.J. Patterson was then the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And what I remember about the meeting was not all the stuff that I had gone down there to do, which is to keep the other minister in check, but the fact that at the end of the meeting, Chavez took out the Bible and began to read long passages to Fidel Castro from the Bible in Spanish and told Castro that he must find Christ as his personal savior. I thought, this is the most extraordinary meeting I'd ever seen. And there was Castro sitting there with his mouth open going, what? But it was incredible. But yeah, don't do anything unless you have the authority to do it. And you have to also know, writing cabinet papers, because that's how you get a conclusion. And so I was saying this again because often the non-resident ambassadors, because they are not working in the ministry full-time, they are not familiar with the procedures, for example, about how you get to travel somewhere. And so at the last minute, they sort of come running and saying, this and this and this and this, when they may have known 6 months ago that you had to. So our procedures are really slow, they're arcane, and you have to learn how the system works and how to manage your way through the system in order to get things done on a timely basis. And so I would only recommend that to you, is to understand the system and brush up on your ability to navigate through the system. So it's only left for me to congratulate all of you and to wish you well. It's a great job working in the Foreign Service, and we were just Fish. Mackenzie is your son. Yeah. All right. So I don't know why your daddy's a lawyer, so why would you have problems with public speaking? But Mr. Mackenzie is the chairman of the National Insurance Board, by the way. So good to see you here tonight. But good to see all of you, and congratulations. Really do well. I expect long after I'm no longer here, that I hope we have actually set a foundation in a way that while you don't accept everything that I've said, that at least you believe in the construct which will serve the country well going forward. And remember that one of the things Pope John Paul said when he was Pope was that It's not because we're rich or because we're powerful or because we're whatever we are. The fact is, because we're human beings and this is our country, we have a right to exist. And nobody can tell you otherwise. Alma Adams would never back down from anybody, no matter what they said. This is the Bahamas, and you stand up for your country wherever you are and under what circumstances. Arthur Hanna told the South Korean ambassador when he came calling to present his credentials, and he said, you know, South Korea and the Bahamas have something in common. We're both nestled next to giants, and we're only as independent as the giants allow. But having said that, there's space enough for us to stand up against those who say they'll flatten us if we shoot rockets at them. And, you know, if you're an idiot, you're an idiot. So, bless you all. I wish you well, and I hope to shake hands with you at the end. Thank you for inviting me to come to this. It's really well done, and I wish you all.
Yeah, I know that. Right there, what I covered. That's